Good evening. Welcome to another program from FLARE, the First Ladies Association for Research and Education. I'm Myra Gooden. I'm the president of FLARE, and I'm very happy to be with you again. We sincerely apologize for some of the problems that we had earlier with YouTube. We are going to be working to make sure that things like this won't happen again, but we do appreciate your understanding. Without further ado, I have a question for everyone in the audience. What do these women have in common? Greer Garson, Jean Stapleton, Patti LuPone, Jenna Rollins, Michelle Pfeiffer, and Viola Davis. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar to all of the members of our audience tonight, but let me assure you that the women that I've just named have all played First Ladies, have all portrayed First Ladies in film or on the stage. And as we spoke about the presence of First Ladies in film and television, tonight's program took on special significance. Becoming Mamie, Bess and Hillary, with Kay Sebring Kuhlmann. She has many interesting perspectives to share with us on the process of doing their portrayals, and I know that you're going to enjoy what she has to say. I'd like to introduce my friend and colleague and the treasurer of FLARE, Diana Carlin, who is going to be in conversation with Kay. Diana?
Thank you, Myra. And Kay, thank you so much for joining us. I've known Kay for 30 years maybe, and have seen some of her live productions. And Kay is an inaugural lifetime member of FLARE, and we're excited to have her share her experiences in bringing these women to life on stage. So I'll give you a little bit of background about Kay. She's a graduate of the University of Iowa with a bachelor's degree in general studies, and she holds an MA in theater with an emphasis on playwriting and dramaturgy from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She grew up in a large family homestead in Wyoming. And since finishing her master's degree, she's really earned her living largely for many years between 1989 and 2000, creating and mounting multi-character historical plays and for museums and institutions and various events. And then she began doing these one-woman shows. And you're going to see her first she's going to talk about her first three one-woman shows tonight. So Kay, it's a pleasure to be with you virtually. And thank you for sharing your experiences tonight. So let me begin with a question on what got you interested in First Ladies.
I think most young women of my generation, I did not really have much particular interest growing up. I would hear my parents talk about various presidents and also First Ladies. And then, like a lot of preteens in the early 60s, I became enamored of Jackie Kennedy. My interest then waned again, really all the way into adulthood. And it is only through my work and almost happenstance that I became interested in First Ladies in depth.
Well, you not only became interested, you actually became the First Ladies through an interesting process, and that's what we're going to talk about. So why don't we start with Mamie? And Mamie, as all of you remember, was First Lady from 1953 to 1961. She was one of the several generals' wives whose husbands were well known for their war heroism and for basically Dwight Eisenhower saving the world from Nazism. And tell us how that commission, because this is the one that started it all, how did that come about?
This was the beginning of my one-woman shows and my First Lady trilogy, as I refer to it. I was writing a play for Kansas State Historical Society, their history museum, on their one-room school, on their grounds. And I was in residence for quite a while in 1989. And there came around a list put out by this special commission called the Eisenhower Centennial Commission, which was going to celebrate Ike's birthday all across Kansas in 1990. And they had even designated somebody on a one-year detail from one of their institutions for a full-time job. So they sent around this list of all the events they had planned, and I believe they had 100 events on there. And I said to the director of museum, do you notice something strange about this list? And he said, oh, looks interesting. Not anywhere do you see the word Mamie. Somebody needs to write a play about Mamie. And he said, fine, when you get this one done, why don't you do it? And so I said, oh, okay. And then I said, so how will we get somebody to play her? Because we wanted to do it during Women's History Month that following year. And he said, why don't you do it? You know how to act. And I thought, okay. So that was the genesis. It was commissioned in the sense that they promised me at the History Museum 3 performances and that I would be paid for those performances. And after that, I would be on my own, but the commission would soon learn over the course of that next year how very popular this would prove to be. They had requests from everywhere. It wasn't an official part of their list, but they ended up getting just dozens, I think several hundred requests from towns all over Kansas for Mamie to come. So that's the beginning of it.
So how did you get into this? What was your way into the character, to getting to know Mamie? Tell us a little bit about the research and how you developed
I was given access to all their information in this office they had set up for this commission, and that I could look through things and see what I could find on Mamie. And what I soon learned as I began to approach research for her is that there was no definitive biography or any sourced material about Mamie. No book. There were several books out, but they were kind of books that were thrown together, and you could see that the material had come from magazine articles, and they did have indexes, but they were not sourced biographies of Mamie. So I did not have that to draw on. I did have one source that proved to be valuable. Can you see this?
A little higher.
This is a book of letters that was published, and it was put together by John S.D. Eisenhower, their son. And these were letters that Ike wrote to Mamie during World War II, 319 of them in this book. No letters from her back, but as you know, in the day when people wrote letters, you can pretty much tell what the other person is saying when you have a series of letters that many of which are responses to her letters, as you can tell in the letters themselves. So I did have
So let me interrupt you a second. So the Marilyn Holt biography at the
that
University
did not come out until
that came after
2007.
that. Okay.
Actually, so I began writing this in 1989 and had to have it up in March of 90. So the Marilyn Holt biography did not exist then. I believe that was published in 2007. So I had no books that were actually, so what I started doing is putting together from the sources that they did have in their files, newspaper clippings. I read books about Ike, so I could glean some information from that. And also there are a lot of magazine articles about her I was able to access. Keep in mind, this is before things are online too, before you can find things digitally. So you have to go places to find things. But what I would do once I started going out into the state of Kansas and given these performances. Whenever I would get a request from a town, I would ask them to go down to their newspaper and see if they could find anything from those files that indicated she had ever been there, that there's any connection of that town to her. So I did glean a lot of information that way. And I also found a lot of magazine articles about Mamie at the time she was First Lady. You know, they would do these long photo essays in Life magazine, those kinds of things. So as far as how I would approach this, go ahead and pull up that slide on the brochure. It turns out the Kansas History Museum had a designer in their print shop who designed all the brochures, who was so on top of her job that she had already created a brochure before I had even decided how I was going to structure this play or exactly what I was going to include. So she already had it out and it was already being advertised. So I was actually instructed in what types of things I would include by the brochure itself. And what it indicated to me is that they wanted a really panoramic view of her. You see on the front of the brochure over there on the left, that is Mamie as a young woman before her marriage. That's actually her wedding day. And then you see the picture of her in the Oval Office. So I actually got my instruction for what kinds of things I needed to include that way. Go ahead and pull up the script on the next slide. I don't know if you can actually see this yourselves, but first of all, this was a one-woman play, a theatrical production, as opposed to somebody doing first-person interpretation, and there is a difference. So it has a structure, it has a plot, it has a really a point of view. One thing I did know that would be my point of view as I read about Mamie is that this would not be a character who would be putting herself front and center in what she talks about when she talks about herself. She would be talking about her relationships with other people. And also that she would, having been raised first as a debutante in Denver, and then later as an Army wife of an officer, she would be very welcoming of an audience. And I also perceived from everything I read in photos that she's a feminine person. And so it occurred to me that because I was only 39 years old at the time, and I would be playing, remember they want me to do it all the way through the presidency, at least, I would be playing a woman in her 70s at that point. So I decided to begin the play by me being totally in the dark in a space that you can tell is an attic of some sort, and I would be holding a candle illuminating my face, so that initially you cannot really tell my age, and that I would start that way, and then the audience will discover me in the attic, the lights would come up on the stage, and I would discover that I'm being overheard. So if you can imagine up in the attic, the character holding the candle, and she is in her memory, and she says, "Ike, I miss you every day. Forgive me for not getting to Abilene to visit you sooner. I took the train, you know, still afraid of flying. Next year, the Secret Service boys say they'll drive me all the way from Gettysburg." You would laugh if you could see me standing here all dressed up in my hat and high heel shoes. I still always wear them. I'm getting a little wobbly on them, though. I'm astonished to be growing old. In my mind's eye, I am still that little girl skating up and down the sidewalk in Denver. And it proceeds like that for a few more moments. And so you know that she's in her imagination of having recently been to see Ike at his grave in Abilene, Kansas, and that she is in her attic or somewhere in her Gettysburg retirement home after his death. And so once the lights pop up, they pop up, and she sees that she's being observed, at which point she then includes the audience in a characteristic of Mamie of always being welcoming to whomever shows up for whatever reason they are there. And that's a major consideration about her as a character. For the first part of the play, and I divided into 2 acts, but they're not very long acts, about 25 minutes each. She has a trunk from which she pulls out things that take her back from her girlhood to her meeting of Ike, to their marriage, to, and it's largely through diary entries with asides and objects. You find out about the death of their firstborn son early in their marriage. That part of the play ends with his early military service and the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor. And then after a very short recess for the audience, she comes back in a White House dress, in a First Lady dress. And remember, she was 56 when she became First Lady. So I'm playing her at 56, and gives the audience a look at, some of the finery of being First Lady. And she says, remember, the last thing you heard was that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. But now she starts with, let's talk about something more pleasant, the White House years. And she talks about really this being the only home that they really had. And for a long period of time because of their many moves. And she reflects on the presidency and her years in the presidency or in the First Ladyship, and it's an experience she greatly loved. It then, it pulls in a lot of things from research, which were from presidential files that I obtained, letters from the National Archives. And she does read from a few letters written to her. And she talks about, for example, things that place you in the era of the presidency. A letter she got from some young girls who were trying to get her to talk Ike into making an exception for Elvis Presley, so he wouldn't be drafted into the army. And so she would tell how she responds to these various letters. And she talks about a lot of things having to do with the years in the White House. But she then goes back at one point and talks about some of the questions she would be asked in reception lines. And she mentions a few of the questions. And she says what the answers were when she's greeting people. And then she mentions that there actually had been people who would actually ask her about Ike and another woman. And this is where I use 3 letters from Ike, where he obliquely addresses the subject. You can tell that she has written and asked him things from his responses. And the last letter I use is at the very end of the play, where he talks at length. It's on her 42nd birthday, which would have been in, 42, that would have been in 46. And he ends the letter by saying, I've never wanted any other wife. This is midway through the letter. You're mine. And for that reason, I've been luckier than any other man. I feel my duties in life are so big, so vast, that my mind completely refuses to visualize anything beyond my duty. But I do hope to do my duty so well that regardless of what may happen to me, you and John can always be proud that we 3 are one family. I do not seek rank. I do not seek acclaim. But if my own conscience tells me I've done well, I can always come back to you in the certainty that my place in your heart will be as big as ever. And she folds up that letter and she goes back to her very first line. Ike, I miss you every day. I think about my visits to Abilene to see you in your final resting place, and I look at those words. You wrote them, your inaugural prayer. And then she recites his inaugural prayer. And Eisenhower was at that time the only president to write his own inaugural prayer. And it's short and it's lovely. And then that is the end of the play. She has picked up the candle again and does the inaugural prayer with the candle again as the lights dim. Okay, we head to the next script.
Okay.
One thing, excuse me, to the next slide. These are early photos of me in the role of Mamie. One thing that I do for all my first ladies is I use clothing that is actually from the period of the character. I don't have anything made. I actually find clothes from the period. So this was 32 years ago that I started doing Mamie. And of course, it would be harder to do that now. You know, they disappear more and more as the years go by. But at the time, in 1990, I was able to find the number of dresses that are suitable for Mamie. So that is one photo on the left, and that's in black and white, of course, but that is a pink kind of polissoir dress. And then the picture on the right, that is another pink dress that I've worn on another occasion. Something interesting about doing Mamie. When I would travel around to other locations, oftentimes the sponsor would have added something that was important to them. And this big mural that's painted on canvas was actually painted by a student at Kansas State University in the art class. And he came to me right before the performance and asked, that is their wedding day, and asked if he could hang it on the back wall. And then he gave it to me as a gift after that. So when I did performances, if it was an appropriate venue, I would sometimes use it, and then sometimes I did not.
Oh, I thought it was the actual photograph that they have at the library, but it's a painting.
No, that is actually see me in relationship to it. It's huge, and it creates a back wall of their wedding day photo.
So you did adapt as you went from one place to another.
Oh, yes. And, you know, you
local
just, and you have to adapt your script too, because you might not have special lighting, and you have to kind of pull out things that work and leave aside things that don't, depending on the venue. And I would always work in to every town I went. If somebody asked, as I had asked them to do, found me information about Ike or Mamie and their town, I would work it into the script and memorize it, worked into the script. And of course, this is very thrilling to communities. Mamie lived lots of places, 38 places during their marriage. And she was actually from a family where the father was quite the adventurer. He was the owner of a meatpacking plant in Iowa, but got the bug to move west, and they moved to Denver, which was a very young city at the time they moved out there. So she knew people from everywhere. And so I decided to take advantage of that. And that must mean that there are lots of newspaper clippings about Mamie and Ike visiting various places. So if somebody went to the trouble, if a community went to the trouble of sending me something, I always worked it into the script for their performance.
And then as you did more research, did the script then change over time or stay relatively stable?
Yes, the script did change a little, and it changed largely because I would get, go ahead to the next slide. I would get requests for shorter performances, and they'd be from very specialized groups. So the one on the left is a picture of me as Mamie, where I was invited to perform for veterans groups, and they only wanted about 40 minutes. So I would concentrate on things, really pull out things having to do with his military service and their military life together. And then I started getting asked to do chautauquas. And this is a very specialized kind of dramatic performance where it's real regimented how it works. You speak as a character, you then take questions as that character, and you then remove something to indicate you're an actor. And that now you're speaking, you know, you just stand differently, that you are now answering questions as the person who created the character. So that also required tweaking of the script. Now, as far as revising, so in the case of Mamie, it really had to do with going places where there would be people who knew her, and I would try to work in some of the things. Now, some of the other places that have a lot of Mamie materials, there's the Mamie Eisenhower birthplace in Boone, Iowa, which had me several times early in my performance of Mamie. And then I had access to all their materials. In 1996, 6 years into my performance as Mamie, I was asked to do her in Boone, Iowa at the Birthplace Museum. Actually, it was in a much bigger venue, but they sponsored it. And that this was to celebrate her 100th birthday. And I knew that Susan Eisenhower, her granddaughter, had written a new biography of Mamie, but it was not yet out. I did not have access to it. And I knew that she and a couple other members of the family would be at that performance. What I did not know, so I did nothing having to do with trying to find an advance copy of her biography. What I did not know is that she'd be staying at the same bed and breakfast as I did. And I noticed as I signed in that she had signed in right before me. And I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to have to try to avoid her in case some of my facts aren't quite wrong. And Susan Eisenhower's biography is a definitive biography and sourced of Mamie, and it came out so in 96, so 13 years before Marilyn Holtz. And so I thought, oh, well, she didn't say anything to me after the performance. She didn't come to greet me or anything. But the next morning I hear a knock at the door, and it's the proprietor of the bed and breakfast saying, Susan Eisenhower would like you to have breakfast with her. And I thought, oh man, I am in trouble now. So I went down to have breakfast with her, and she said, and this is a high compliment, I thought, how did you know those things about my grandmother? And I said, what things? And she said, well, your responses to just things that are not in any books about my grandmother, her emotional responses. And I said, well, I put myself in her place and built in what my responses would be in her place had I had her upbringing. And she said, well, you got it pretty right. And so I then read the biography, and really there were only a couple little details that I did have to change in my script that were just not quite right. And it would be things like her saying in the script that I pass by your statue every morning in Gettysburg Square, when actually it's not in Gettysburg Square, it is at Gettysburg College. So, you know, those kinds of little details. And then another thing that happened with my research that gave me all kinds of revising opportunities and really addition opportunities to add things is that I was invited by the Eisenhower Farm, which is part of the Gettysburg Historic Site, to come and be a living historian for 6 months on a contract. And I didn't want to do Mamie in that kind of setting, you know, day in, day out. They asked me if I would like to create a character of a reporter who follows the First Lady and is often on the grounds at Eisenhower Farm. This is where they retired to after the presidency. And they had a library there, and they had copies of, you know, lots of things from other sources that they had obtained copies of. So I had 6 months where I was being paid as a contractor to be a living historian as a reporter, when actually that reporter was also gathering information that I could then use to tweak my script.
Oh, and you entertained me and another one of our FLARE founders, Nancy Keegan Smith. and
Yes.
gave us a tour of the farm and the house in that character. It was great. So shall we move on to Bess?
Let me show one more
Okay.
slide.
Okay.
This is Susan Eisenhower that's me standing at breakfast. And then you asked me about reactions. And I had a couple of things I wanted to mention because it was meaningful to me about audience reactions. There are several that were important to me. Let's see if I can find them. One was, of course, I had Susan Eisenhower and then, you know, little blurbs on a brochure from the director of the library and so forth, but I can't, here we go. A small town in Kansas where there are some, you know, laugh lines built into the script where no one made a peep for the entire play. And I thought, oh, I'm gonna have to sneak out of town, not a peep. And stood up in silence, in unison, and gave me a standing ovation at the end. It was, that was interesting. In Augusta, Georgia, I came out after the performance, after I changed my clothes, and man was standing in the alley. And he said, I didn't want to embarrass you inside, but I want to tell you, you were talking about the death of your son at 3.5 years and your intense grief and the conflicts in your marriage that arose from your grief and handling it differently. My teenage daughter was murdered last year, and it meant so much to me to hear at a distance from somebody else who had lost a child. And then another particular memory I have of an audience reaction was at Fort Leavenworth on base, and they operate an elementary school. It's the Eisenhower Elementary School. And I performed for children, and they were, I think, 9 and 10-year-olds. And at the end, one African-American girl stood up and she said, next time, would you do Coretta Scott King? And I said, you know, I wasn't sure what to say. I said, do you think I can do Coretta Scott King? And she said, yes, you would be a wonderful Coretta Scott King. So.
Hey, shall we move on to
Yes.
Bess Truman? Very different background from Mamie. So how did you get into that character?
Okay, this one I was invited to perform early in '91 by the National Archives in Washington, D.C., down on the National Mall. They have a theater in that building that they have presentations at, and they asked me to come and perform Mamie. And right after the performance, the director of education of the museum said, what other first ladies do you do? And I said, well, this is the only one I do. And she said, what other first ladies could you do? And I said, well, I live about 30 miles from the Truman Library, maybe Bess Truman. And she went into her office and she drew up a contract, and that was a direct commission, and where I was paid a certain amount to write it and then a certain amount for performances. And that was on the basis of having seen my Mamie and her realizing, well, I think something happened in the elevator while I was there doing Mamie that might have something to do with that. I was in the elevator the next day and I was going to some lecture or something. And afterwards, I was in the elevator as myself, and I said to whoever was in the elevator with me, wasn't that great? And the person said, yeah, it was great, but you should have been here yesterday. You would not have believed this performance of Mamie Eisenhower. And so the National Archives then had me back the next year as Bess. And there was so much more material available on Bess. And I was able to easily access it at the Truman Library, but also Margaret, their adult daughter, had written a very good sourced biography called Bess W. Truman in 1986. It's really, really good. And then there is a book of letters called Dear Bess, Harry S. Truman and Robert Farrell. Truman himself wrote the letters, and this Robert Farrell annotated them and got them published, and there are over 500 of them. And they begin in 1910 when Bess was by then 25 years old. And Harry, who she had known in school since she was 5 and he was 6, came a courting when he was 26 and she was 25. And he lived on a farm down south of Independence. And he began writing her letters, and he never stopped. He courted her for 8 years, almost 9, before she agreed to marry him. He wrote her letters from World War I. He, in his job as a commissioner, would go on these trips to visit his constituencies, and she would go and he'd write her letters. He wrote her letters when he was in the US Senate. She did not go along much of the time. She stayed back in Independence. And he wrote her letters even when they lived in the White House together. So there's just this treasure trove of letters. So what do you find out about Bess Truman from all of that is that she was an extremely, especially Margaret's book, extremely private. She actually was kind of known for saying no comment to many things. She's no comment, meaning I don't want to talk to you. Again, we wanted something that takes her all. She was 60 when she became First Lady and was so in her late 60s then when they left the Oval Office. And then again, I wanted to portray her for longer than just that far. And so I really had to create a structure where she could go from her 20s into her early 80s, late 70s or early 80s. Now, once you realize that there is no way Bess Truman is going to see the audience and all of a sudden decide it would be the polite thing to do to start telling them things. So I had to create something. Go ahead and go to the next slide. That would explain why Bess Truman would be talking to people out in the audience. So what I did is I created a museum exhibit. She actually appears for the first time as a museum exhibit with a sheet on top of her and a sign next to her that says Bess W. Truman, and it says First Lady and the years she was First Lady. And I decided the only way Bess Truman is going to tell you anything is if you are at the museum looking at this exhibit and you're getting to look at these brochures that say certain things about her and she begs to differ. And so I would read something when she comes to life, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide. There she is as a museum exhibit. The other thing about Bess, because she lived to be so old, 97, I placed her more in this exhibit as in her late 70s. She started wearing glasses at some point, and I went ahead for the exhibit and have her in glasses. And then the interesting thing about Bess is that, you know, physically, she's kind of the opposite of Mamie. And so I had costumes that helped me look less traditionally feminine and more boxy. And she was extremely athletic. She had been a tennis player. Go back one slide, would you? Because I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this worked script-wise. So she comes to life. You saw her there. She has a sheet over her. They take the sheet off. They're getting ready to open this exhibit. The docent leaves and she springs to life when they are not there. And she starts reading what is said about her on these various brochures. Here's one. Elizabeth Virginia Wallace, known as Bess, was born on February 13th, 1885 in Independence. Her mother, the beautiful Madge Gates, was from a rich family, but her father, David Willock Wallace, was a poor man. Well, he wasn't poor in the ways that count. And then she goes off in a little diatribe about that. Another thing that says there is 20 years after Bess first met Harry in Sunday school, the courtship actually began. Then Bess would have to wait through 9 years of Harry's various financial affairs before she would marry him. She would be. Okay, and so she has something to say about that. At some point, she picks up after she becomes first lady. So this kind of takes her, she has these prompts in the brochure that they have written about her, to which she responds because they're not quite right. And she always has something cantankerous to say at the beginning, but then she sort of gets into telling the story behind it. But once she becomes first lady, I have, as a way of getting her to talk, a steno notebook that they have put there with the exhibit, which is notes from various interviews she had with reporters. And so I pick up the notebook, and as the performer, I read what the reporter asked, and then I answer it without the notebook because it's my answer. So, and it goes through a bunch of things, how she doesn't want to be compared to Eleanor Roosevelt. Well, Eleanor Roosevelt stood up for Marian Anderson and wouldn't go to a tea. I am not a racist, and she will get really defensive about some of these things when the reporters ask her these various questions. So there are a number of them, different subjects, and she responds to what is written as reporter questions in this notebook in the exhibit. So that was fun. And then one of the things you find out about Bess, and she relaxes eventually, is that she was a true political partner with Harry Truman. He did nothing that she didn't know about one thing, and that was the atomic bomb that she found out from the paper when she was on a train on her way back to independence. And that's one thing he kept from her because, as she said, because he knew I would disagree. And they were true partners. And the thing about the Bess Truman play is that this is an era of from 1945 until 1952 that has so much important history. And once I decided that she's his true partner, she has to know that history, and she has to talk about a little about all of it in some way. And so when we got to revisions, go ahead and go to the next slide. I decided at one point that when Bess early in the play is talking about her young womanhood and being courted by Harry, I was doing the various things in that old lady dress. And yes, I was, becoming young in my body stance and hitting the tennis ball and batting baseball. And then I decided I'm really giving her the short shrift here. And that was one of her favorite phrases was short shrift, that you give people a short shrift, and that she was a lovely young woman, and that people would like to see her on stage in two guises: the young Bess that's being courted, who then moves into her 30s, and then the older Bess after she's a senator's wife and a president's wife. And so I divided the play. I did away with the museum thing and divided it at some point into 2 acts, where she's young in the beginning, and in order to have her talking to the audience, she is throwing letters into the fire. It's an imaginary fire, but she's glancing at them and throwing them in there. And she said, Harry came in and caught me doing this. And he said, Bess, you're burning your letters you wrote to me. Think of history. And I said, I have. And I threw some more into the fire. And this is also key to Bess's personality, in that how many relationships would you be would your spouse think it was fine for you to throw away letters they had written to you, which of course are your property, not their property. They sent them to you. And this was how unified the Truman marriage was. He referred to her as the boss. They just had such a love affair, an 83-year love affair. And then I found this picture of her in a floral dress. And so when I do her as a Chautauqua character and I don't have time for a costume change, I have a dress that's sort of in between. And I start out with a young person's wig, long hair, and then later have under that the gray hair. And it's a kind of a dress without a waistline, and it's kind of slightly faded looking, so that I can transition her from a young woman Bess in her 20s and 30s and mother Bess, new mother Bess, and then into an older lady by taking off the long wig and putting the hat on and the glasses on. So I did decide at some point that her youthful Bess deserves its stage time too, and you can't do it in an old lady dress. And there was something that Harry once said to a reporter who asked, why isn't your wife a little bit frumpy, or whatever the question was. That was the implication. And I love this quote. Harry said, "My wife looks exactly the way a woman her age should look." I just thought that, I don't know, it was so funny. They were really an uncommon couple. And this play, when you talk about people's responses to it, it's the hardest one to book because people don't think she will be interesting. And for most people who've seen all three of mine, it's their favorite. I think because she's quite unknown, some of these things are surprising, a person of great depth, and also because it's very staged. It's very staged. It's a real stage character because she ages from really, what you would think of as a really lovely young woman to a really kind of no nonsense, don't bother me with fashion kind of older woman. And I think that really appeals to audiences, but also just that the presidency of Harry Truman was so full of so many things of historical import and interest, and Bess knows it all. One of the things I do, when you ask about response, next slide. Here I'm going to do a little bragging. This is an occasion when David McCullough was in my company as Bess, the author who died just recently and who wrote a definitive biography of Truman that I did not have access to because it was published after I wrote the play. However, I do look at it from time to time and see, because in the Q&A for Bess Truman, I have to know my stuff. So I try to book more than one performance of Bess close to each other time-wise when I'm going to do it, because I read both of these biographies again, because I know I'm going to get lots of really important questions and I want to be able to answer them.
Ready to move on?
Yes. Okay. So Hillary. Let me clear a few things off of here.
Well, Hillary would have been a little easier to do because she's only a few years older.
A few years older than I.
Yes.
You would think so. Okay, so for those of you who are looking really closely, that of course is not Hillary. That is Kay as Hillary. However, I still fight with people over whether or not that is me or Hillary. That is me performing as Hillary. And the genesis of this character was that in late 92, right after Clinton was elected, I was approached by a woman in Lawrence, Kansas, it's a university town, and I was friends with her, asking if I would appear as Hillary in a campaign appearance for her. And I agreed to do that. It was going to be in February. So Clinton was barely inaugurated by the time I undertook that performance. And it was really kind of a personal appearance, but I did memorize things and I did talk about myself a little bit. And in fact, this photo, and go on to the next slide. This photo was then used in a magazine article that pictured several of my other characters on the next page of the article. But this photo was actually taken during the performance by the Lawrence Journal World photographer. So it is a newspaper photo that they gave me permission to use. So research. There were of course all kinds of press accounts about Hillary. No definitive biography, although one came out, a really fast job written by a woman named Donnie Radcliffe. She wrote a really fast job on Hillary Clinton, and it came out really early in '93. I did read that. And then there was something you could subscribe to, and I can't remember how I found out, called the Hillary Clinton Quarterly. And it aggregated things, articles about her, synopsized them and aggregated them, and it came out and you would get it in the mail, and its policy, those kinds of things. So I did subscribe to that. And then of course there were lots and lots of magazine articles about her, Time magazine. I had access to the speech she gave, I believe the first student to be asked to speak at a Wellesley College graduation. And it became somewhat of a famous speech because she really took to task some politicians. And she was in Time magazine at the time for this kind of fiery speech. And then in early '93, the name of the book is Hillary Rodham Clinton, a First Lady for Our Time. So of course, the real task here is in the revising. I had to continually revise my script once I started trying to do it as more like a play, where I would first come on as the college Hillary, and she had the real wild hair and everything, and then comes on as the adult Hillary. I also had access later to her book, It Takes a Village, which talked about her interest in children's rights. And so, it's also important to be prepared for the Q&A by reading some of those books. I tried at various times in various ways to keep up with Hillary physically. Go ahead and next slide. Okay. So as my knowledge grew of Hillary and as the times changed, I tried to update the Hillary look. She often kind of changed her appearance and style, and I try to keep up with that. And it became, really a lot of work to keep up with all the news coming out. And I learned what's so difficult about doing a living person who has a very active life. So a couple of the photos, one of them is she's in a formal gown. And in some venues, I would do a scene where I am actually appearing as First Lady at an event in a formal setting. And then I did do a photo which was supposed to be kind of a takeoff on that famous Obama poster that was so famous, and one that sort of Hillary doing something like that. And then in my last incarnation as Hillary, I went ahead, because I was doing her a lot in classrooms where I would have to change in a restroom. This would be in colleges, and just interact with students as Hillary Clinton, where they could ask me questions, debate me on policy, hear a little bit about my background. So I did at that point actually cut my hair, try to find a suit just like her light blue suit in one of her photos, and actually try to just kind of look like her most of the time. And I did have a plan, assuming that she was perhaps going to be elected, that were she elected, that I might begin doing Hillary only and doing her full time.
All right. So this has been Very interesting, Kay. And if you can turn your camera back on and join me, I just have two last questions before we turn this back over to Myra to say goodnight.
Okay.
Of the three, which is your favorite to do?
Well, the easiest one for me to do, and this, I don't know why this is true because, hold on, let me get, okay, can you see me?
Not yet.
I don't know why this is true, but Mamie's the easiest for me to do. And Bess is the physically hardest for me to do and the most challenging, but in some ways she's my favorite. And Hillary is actually, of the three, my least favorite, because it is so much work to be constantly prepared. You have to kind of be in constant preparation. So I do offer them and have, they put together a First Ladies of the Heartland, one day Mamie, one day Bess, only the opposite order because their order is opposite as First Ladies. So you go see Bess one day and then the next day you go see Mamie. And that's been popular at colleges and theater series where you see both of them and you really see the distinction. And then Ike and Harry were as unalike as Bess and Mamie were in their temperaments. So that's always interesting too.
Last question. If you were to do another First Lady, who would it be?
I have done two others. And one of them is Edith Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt's second wife, but for many, many years, and the mother of his children, all except Alice. His wife died soon after giving birth, as you may remember. And that's considered one of the great presidential marriages. And I did her as a special event in commemoration of the 100th anniversary of Armistice Day, because all of their children, including the girl, their children together served in the military. And so they were quite the, one of them killed in service. They were quite the patriots. And so I did her and I really liked doing her. And I haven't done her since. And I just did a 30-minute thing. And then I did Jackie Kennedy. What I learned about Jackie Kennedy is that, first of all, you have to be on a constant diet and to do her. People know so much about her. In some ways, it's a challenge to do anything that surprises them in any way. So if I'm going to do one more, I tell you who I would love to do, and I need to go spend some time in Georgia to get the accent of Rosalind Carter. I would love to do her. I think I even sort of look like her in the face. And I would go down and get the accent down, really spend some time down there because that's really important for her. But I'm a great admirer of her.
All right. Well, in fact, that is a great segue into Myra, who is going to, I think, close us out and tell you about what we're doing next month. So, Kay, thank you again for joining us. Fascinating to listen to you, and I hope people can get to see you perform someday. So, Myra, take it away.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yes, Kay, once again, yes, thank you from all of us at FLARE for sharing your experiences, how you prepare, the research that you do. I wish that we had even more time to do more probing of the process with you. But we are really in your debt. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. To our members who are watching, once again, we regret the technical difficulties this evening, but we hope that you'll be able to enjoy this Zoom program. And as Kay was just telling us, that at some point she'd like to be able to portray Rosalind Carter. Our program in November, on November 7th at 7 p.m. is going to be Rosalind Carter, Jimmy Carter's Secret Weapon. Yes, hope you'll tune in as well, Kay.
I will.
Those who may be watching tonight who are not members of FLARE, if you're interested in joining our organization, we hope you are, please go to our website, which is flare-net.org. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good evening. Good night.